Over the last years, and in particular since Trump came back to power, many have been saying that we are heading for a repeat of the 30s, that what Trump and what the AfD, what Meloni, what Marine Le Pen, what Farage, what they all represent is the beginning of fascism. Now this is accentuated by these far-right riots that we've seen, in particular in the last years in Britain, but also the increased repression from the state, the ICE police in the US, the repression against the Palestine movement. And all this has instilled a fear in many people, but also a willingness to fight back. But this eagerness to fight back amongst ordinary youth and workers, that has to be separated from the attempts by liberals, by reformist politicians, by bourgeois media, that is opposed to Trump and Farage and so on for their own reasons, that are howling about the so-called threat against democracy, the threat of fascism from these parties. And their message to all those young people around the world who are scared and who wants to fight is that we must rally behind people like Starmer, although he's gone now, people like Macron, the Democrats in the US. They tell us that we have to rally behind Macron and the Democrats in the US to defend democracy. They tell us that we must defend the status quo, that we should defend the state, defend the capitalist stability, help them to do that, because otherwise we will have fascism. Now this term fascism, it's being thrown around a lot, and it seems to mean just about anything. Just about any state that is slightly repressive, slightly authoritarian. For example, according to a former leading member of the Left Party in Sweden, Ali Esbati, Sweden currently has Europe's most fascist government. I wasn't aware I was living under fascism. And when the Swedish government curtailed the right to strike in 2018, a left-wing organization said that to ban or to curtail the right to strike, that is fascism. Piers Morgan interviewed Slavoj Žižek some months ago. He was saying, it doesn't have to be like Hitler, there's many different versions of fascism. And Piers Morgan, I don't like the guy, but he questioned him a bit and said, well, if it's just about anything, you could call pretty much anyone you don't like a fascist. Doesn't that make that term meaningless? And Zizek, he was like, we're not so different, you and I, we kind of think alike, with his always trying to fight his own face, basically. I'm not a fan of his ideas, but I'm a massive fan of his mannerisms. But he said, what I'm trying to do is to water down and extend the notion of fascism. Very true. To argue like this, to say that every government that bans or removes democratic rights is fascist, then you can only draw one conclusion, that as long as we have lived under capitalism, perhaps under all class societies, we have lived under fascism. Then Trump coming to power, the growing support for the AfD and so on, does not represent a shift or a new danger, which they say it does. Or you can draw another conclusion, one they want you to think, that at some point in time under capitalism, there existed a pure democracy. A liberal democracy that existed perhaps right until Trump and his law started to attack it. This pure democracy has never existed. And Ted Grant made this point when he argued against Pierre Frank, who said that only military dictatorships were possible after the Second World War in Europe. And to prove this, he constantly compared the limited democratic rights in those regimes that he refused to call democratic with some genuine democratic regime that in reality had never existed anywhere. And Ted, he said this, "It is ABC that the democratic liberties were gained in the struggle against the bourgeoisie. Over a period of a century, the right to vote had to be fought for and wrested from the bourgeoisie. At a period of ascending capitalism, at the time of the blossoming of bourgeois democracy, even in its heyday, there was never an idyllic democratic state without police intervention and without brute force." And to say that only now that Trump is in power has the American state become violent, only now it is repressive, attacking democratic rights, attacking the freedom of the press, that this is something new in the US. is ridiculous if you only take a quick look at the history of the US. Very long history of exclusion from all democratic rights for black people. The history of violent repression against black people, Native Americans, trade unionists, communists, socialists. The history of political assassinations. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the executions of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. McCarthyism, COINTELPRO. Patriot Act under George W. Bush. What is this pure American democracy that liberals speak of, that Trump is attacking? When did it exist? Never. The state under capitalism and under all class societies is and always has been a tool of the ruling class. And this is clear even if you look at maybe like the opposite of the US, a country like Sweden. Say during the post-war period, a period in which many said Sweden was a socialist country. Now, social democracy ruled in Sweden uninterruptedly between 1936 and 1976, 40 years. And they did carry out massive reforms that significantly improved the lives of the working class, which led to a lot of illusions that people started to believe that maybe bourgeois democracy was really working in the interests of the majority. And this idea that it was left-wing to defend the state, because the state was on the side of the working class, or at least neutral. But it wasn't. The reforms carried out were possible, like in all other Western countries in this period, because of the massive post-war boom. The reforms ended in the 70s when that boom ended, and the state in the hands of social democracy was decidedly on the side of the ruling class. Not only did they never come close to ending capitalism, they acted very consciously to prop up the big monopolies. They carried out a number of policies to favor monopolization. They claimed to be neutral in the Cold War, but they were always allied with the US behind the scenes. And the state that kept a close eye on the communist movement, the social democracy even set up their own secret police to spy on and blacklist communists. And when it was uncovered by journalists in 1973, those journalists went to prison. This is what democracy is under capitalism. It is the rule of the capitalists. And the democracy might vary, and the state can take many different forms. Monarchy, republic, democracy, military dictatorship, semi-dictatorship, fascism. The state will always remain an instrument to uphold capitalism and defend the interests of the ruling class. And Lenin explained this, and this is something that all so-called left-wingers should listen to. It is natural for a liberal to speak of democracy in general, but a Marxist will never forget to ask, for what class? Democracy under capitalism is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And this is precisely what is becoming very clear to many now with the Epstein scandal, how much they rule behind the scenes. How much is decided not in parliament, but on dinners, yachts, on islands. Of course, even if bourgeois democracy is a sham to a large extent, even if the ruling class has a lot more possibility of using the rights which on paper exist for everyone, this doesn't mean that it matters not if these rights are abolished. The attitude of Marxists is not, look, the state is always a tool of the ruling class, so we don't care if it's fascist or democratic. It matters if there's some state repression every now and then, or if it's a lot all the time. It matters if we have the right to abortion, the freedom of assembly, the right to strike. And it is clear that currently democratic rights are being curtailed, not just by governments or parties that liberals like to call fascist, but by the liberals and reformists themselves. And this is obviously something that we fight against. But at the same time, we have to say that increased repression is not the same thing as a full-blown dictatorship, and even less fascism. And in order to know what slogans should we use, what methods do we need, how do we struggle now? In order to be able to say, if the world is going fascist, to know how to fight it, one has to be able to clearly state what fascism is and how it differs from a bourgeois democratic regime and a military dictatorship. what we Marxists call Bonapartism. Don't have time to go into it. And here, of course, it is different in different countries. Some countries have a dictatorship, some do not. But what we're talking about here is the general process. Is there an imminent threat of a fascist wave all over Europe and in the Americas? Is in the heartland of capitalism, is this an actual thing that's going to happen now? Now, many say, okay, maybe it's not full-blown fascism yet. Maybe Trump isn't even a dictatorship yet. Trump has a plan. He's not going to allow another election to take place. Thing is, it's not just up to Trump, which he is finding out currently that he can't decide everything, get his will through. I'm sure he would love to be a dictator, rule the world and the universe, but he alone cannot decide it. And even if he had the backing of a large section of the ruling class to go for a full-blown dictatorship, it would not just be up to them as well. Now, the rule of the state is to defend the interests of the ruling class, yes, but this doesn't mean that the capitalists hold absolute power over the state. It doesn't work like the Illuminati, even though with Epstein a bit like that. But capitalism, as we know, is not a planned economy. It's not a planned system. All capitalists do not have the same interests at all times. Generally, they don't. They're competing against each other. So the idea that they can all get in a room together and decide on what's needed and then give orders to the state, that's simply not how capitalism works. And what the left-wing people, who are also very scared about fascism, tend to forget. Ruling class is not the only class under capitalism that has power. There's another class called the working class, and in order to establish a dictatorship in a country like the US, Britain or France, where there is a large working class, which has been nurtured with the illusions in democracy for a long time, it would take a lot for the ruling class to be able to just go over to dictatorship. The working class would have to be thoroughly defeated. And we got a taste of this with the ICE raids. As we saw in Minneapolis, the ICE raids provoked a massive clash with the state, where the state had to back down, at least temporarily, due to the size, the mood, and the level of organization of that movement. If they tried to go for a full-blown dictatorship in these circumstances, it wouldn't last a day. I mean, they wouldn't get to that first day. Only when the working classes tried and tried and tried again and failed to change society and has become so demoralized, so defeated that it's unable to resist any longer, only then would the ruling class be able to move towards dictatorship. Now, fascism demands a lot more than that, because fascism is not just dictatorship. Mussolini's way to power, as well as Hitler's and Franco's, Mussolini and Franco, it differs from how an ordinary military dictatorship comes to power. They were not simply using the state machinery, the police and the military, to take over the state, but on a mass movement outside of the state. They based themselves on the enraged middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, peasants, owners of small shops and the like, layers that had been ruined after the First World War and then after the crash in 1929, and declassed elements, lumpenproletariat, criminals and the like, that is downtrodden layers of society, yet not part of the working class, and so could be turned against them. And the fascists fed them lies of how they would take up the struggle against the banks and the big monopolies, and then turn them instead against the working class to completely smash the labor movement, the communist parties, the social democracy, the trade unions. The essence of fascism is not the overthrow of bourgeois democracy. That holds true for dictatorship as well, military dictatorship. But it's precisely this annihilation of the labor movement. And by basing themselves on this mass movement outside of the state, and not just the military and the police, Hitler and Mussolini and the like were able to smash the labor movement much more than any ordinary military dictatorship could. But this mass movement was only possible to create in a special situation where the bourgeoisie could no longer tolerate any concessions to the working class. It wasn't enough that the labor movement was holding back the working class. It needed the working class to be able to resist for a long time. And so it funded fascism to crush the labor movement. But also on the other hand, where the working class, or rather the leadership of the working class, had been unable to provide a way out. In Italy, Spain and Germany, the peasants, the middle class and the cities, they didn't look towards fascism first. When the crisis in society was aggravated, they first looked towards the proletariat to lead them a way out. But the failure of the revolution in Italy in 1919 and 1920, the revolutions in Germany in 1918 to 1923, in Spain 1931 to 37, that opened up for fascist and bourgeois agitators who said that the problem in society is that there's too many strikes, it's communism, it's revolution, it's causing chaos and disorder. And in a sense, that's true. Class struggle causes disorder. And if it doesn't lead to a conclusion, capitalism, then it's possible for those fascist agitators to turn peasants and the like against the striking working class by saying that what's needed is a strong man, a strong state to bring order and stability. And of course, they also said we're going to end the banks and break up the big monopolies. It's going to be the dream society of the small man, which didn't happen. In all countries that turned fascist, there wasn't just a little repression. It's not just banning of the right or the curtailing of the right. It was, as in the case of Germany, hundreds of thousands of SA brown shirts, trained, organized and armed, organized by the help and the protection of the state and the ruling class. And they went around and systematically killed trade unionists, communists, socialists, breaking up their meetings, burning down their offices, all on a mass scale. Now, this is not what we're seeing currently in Italy under Meloni. I think we will hold a meeting here otherwise. Or under Trump in the US. Trump's administration is not a fascist dictatorship. He did not come to power on the back of a mass movement, roaming around, killing labor activists. The trade unions have not been smashed. It's not even a dictatorship. Trump did not come to power through a military coup, but by winning the elections. I know it hurts to say that for some people maybe, but he did. And yes, there is state repression under Trump. We see that in all countries. We're going to see more of it. It's inevitable with the deepening of the crisis of capitalism. That's still not fascism. And I think we talked about this yesterday. All the struggle around Trump, it also reflects that there is a major division in the ruling class. A large section of the ruling class, a majority even, did not want Trump to come to power, at least in his first term. They don't trust him. A large section of the state worked against him, especially in his first term. And so his attacks against journalists and academics and so on, a lot of it is in words, but some deeds too. It also reflects this conflict within the ruling class. And that's the same for Marine Le Pen and the AfD and so on. The ruling class does not trust these parties the way they do with their old established party. And if you look at a party like the Sweden Democrats, which is a similar party to the AfD and so on, the Sweden Democrats started as a fascist organization. They were fascists back in the early 90s and late 80s. They understood that if they did not want to remain a sect, they had to change. They got rid of most of the fascists. I mean, there's sure few of them still there. But they no longer train their members to use physical violence against left-wing activists, which is what a fascist organization does. They are like Trump, like Farage, the AfD and all these parties, right-wing demagogues, racist right-wing parties, posing as anti-establishment in order to gain votes. And they grew out of the failure of the left and the Labour movement, and the hatred against all those old parties that had for decades been in power, carrying out massive austerity and attacks against the working class. But again, a bit similarly to the past, they were not the first political expression of the discontent that came after the crisis in 2008. That was the emergence of the new left. Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Corbyn in Britain, Sanders in the US, Mélenchon, who also posed as something different, using more radical slogans, posing as anti-establishment, giving people hope by putting forward real reforms that would really make a difference, only to then one by one cower and surrender, or like Syriza, come to power and carry out even worse austerity. And so the right-wing demagogues grew out of this when a large section of the working class and the youth were desperately looking for an alternative. And here comes Trump, talking about how corrupt all of Washington is, how he's going to drain the swamp, bring jobs back to America, stop wars. He won over, especially the last election, not just white Americans, but black Americans, Muslims, PBS interviewed some Arab Americans in November 2024 who had voted for Trump in the hopes that he would be more tough on Israel than Joe Biden. And one explained what others had said to him about why they did so. And he said that they said, we had a choice between someone actively shooting and killing you and someone threatening to do so. We had to punish the person who was shooting and killing us at the time. That is Genocide Joe they're talking about. For quite a few people, Trump was seen as the lesser evil to Genocide Joe. And now they're learning that he's not, which has led to a big crisis in the MAGA movement, with all these podcasters coming out against him, and many of Trump's supporters deserting him, because they can see that he is clearly not going to struggle against the Epstein class. He is part of it. I listened to an episode of Tucker Carlson's podcast, or I listened to many. Tucker Carlson, one of these MAGA podcasters. I still haven't listened to the episode about demonic influences in Washington, where he interviews a Catholic priest. I'm getting to that eventually. But there was one episode in particular that was very interesting. He interviewed Saagar Enjeti, who was also one of these MAGA Republicans. I think he was one of the first ones who turned on Trump over Israel. And in the comment section of that episode, it was comment after comment like this. I was MAGA as fuck and I'm done. And I won't vote for Palantir JD either. Another one, my favorite. The illusion of a two-party system is the largest scam those on the left cannot see. They hate Trump so much that they cannot see we do too. It's not about Trump, it's about the system destroying we the people. Very correct. Another one, fuck both sides. They're all playing us. Trump is a disappointment. He is not America. We need a third untainted party. To which one replied, perhaps Third American Revolution Party. I think we can all agree to that one. In short, many of these people are confused. I'm sure if you would look at that episode, you will find some other kind of comments. There's plenty of racist ideas, conspiracy theories, Illuminati and whatnot. But they are very angry at the entire system. They hate the rich. They hate the state. And many of them are ordinary workers and youth who can learn and who are learning. Some of the older ones were precisely workers who looked towards Obama, then Sanders, then Trump. They are not all born racists who only have the capability of moving to the right, which is what I think a lot on the left believe. Oh sure, they reject Trump, but they're only going to become real fascists now. I mean, a few maybe, but most won't. Most will swing far to the left, but it won't be just in a straight line. They will test many different parties, look towards different leaders, but through that experience, and above all through class struggle, they will learn their real interest. And many of those who voted for Trump are ripe and open to an anti-capitalist alternative on the left. But you cannot win them over if all you do is shout at them that they are racists and fascists. You have to offer a class-based alternative that can cut through racism. You have to offer a real fighting program for socialism. But you will not win them over by offering a pro-establishment left alternative. This is precisely how many on the left believe that fascism is to be stopped, by aligning themselves with the establishment, with all so-called democratic forces, aligning themselves with one part of the bourgeoisie against another to defend democracy. That is, they're falling right into the trap that the capitalists want them to. And this, obsession with democracy. I listen a lot to an American hip-hop podcast. And they're sort of like left-wing liberals, yay, Mamdani. And it's always this obsession. People have to register to vote. That's the most important thing. It's important for democracy. Register to vote. Vote for anything, just register. But vote Democrat. About democracy precisely at a time when bourgeois democracy is being discredited, precisely when people are not just losing confidence for the courts, the police, the politicians, media, but when people have a burning hatred towards them. The left is doing their utmost in trying to restore confidence in all these institutions. I don't believe that a lot of the left-wing people are just scared of the AFD and these parties. I think they're scared of the working class. I think they see the threat against democracy coming from the working class. And they might not say this openly, although they constantly talk about it's a real problem that people no longer trust politicians. Such a shame. And when I run for office, I want to be trusted and have a lot of money in my pocket. They use the threat of fascism as the apology to support anyone other than the party that they've designated as fascist. As we heard about yesterday in the World Perspectives discussion, about Die Linke, all the hopes that young people had for them, only to enable Merz to carry out massive austerity and militarization. In Sweden, the social democracy has done all these very dirty deals for about a decade now, all with the excuse to stop the Sweden Democrats. What's happened in the meantime? Well, the Sweden Democrats, like the AFD, has grown, but also all other parties have adopted the policies of the Sweden Democrats. I mean, you really have to look with, magnify it, to see the differences between the policies of the Social Democracy and the Sweden Democrats. It's almost identical. One is fascist and one is social, defending democracy here in the name. And again, in the US, this idea of lesser evilism, it's a sickness plaguing the left. For how long? Decades? Long time? Forever. Yeah. It's always like, oh, but this time it will be a disaster. The world will end. We have to vote Democrat. George W. Bush, he's crazy. Well, didn't end. I mean, he was crazy. The Communist Party of the US, for example, in the 2016 elections, they said that not voting for Hillary Clinton opens the door for the extreme right wing and closes the door on the movement for a progressive agenda. I'm not sure what kind of progressive agenda they're talking about with Clinton, but they didn't explain that either. And again in 2024, they argued for a popular front between workers, sections of business, social movements, and political parties like the Democrats to stop fascism and the MAGA. Now, where does this concept of the popular front come from? Was it a positive experience? Well, it comes from the Communist Party's strategy in the 30s, that they claimed first in France and then in Spain was the way to fight fascism. They formed an alliance that included communist, socialist parties, anarchists in Spain, with bourgeois parties. Bourgeois parties who really represented no significant force in society. Parties like the radicals in France, who was quickly losing support. And as the bourgeoisie at the same time were also abandoning these parties, quickly moving in the direction of fascism. Trotsky said that in Spain that they made an alliance not with the bourgeoisie but with the shadow of the bourgeoisie. A handful of scared lawyers, doctors, politicians who were like, oh, I want a career, fascism is going to end it. But this front, this alliance, was used as an excuse for why the policies that they carried out had to be acceptable to the bourgeoisie. And how did that go? Well, in France, it crippled the revolutionary possibilities opening up after the general strike in 1936. And in Spain, it strangled the revolution from the inside, allowing Franco to come to power and carry out a bloodbath. The idea that one has to unite with all progressive democratic forces in a cross-class collaboration, it ignores the class content and base of fascism. It's like viewing fascism as aliens coming from the sky. It has nothing to do with the current world we live in. It comes from the outside. And all humans have to link arms or grab each other's hands, cry out peace, love and understanding to stop the aliens. I don't think that works against hostile aliens either, but... And it also is just the worst kind of recipe, lesser evilism, as we saw, not just in Spain and in France, but in Italy and Germany. I mean, the workers desperately wanted to fight. The rank and file really tried, in Italy and in Spain, in Germany too, but the leaders did everything to sabotage it from above. In Italy, the Socialist Party begged the state to intervene against the fascists. The same state that was aiding and protecting the fascists. The Socialist Party was offered weapons, but refused to say, it's the duty of the state to defend the citizens. In January 1921, the trade union paper Battaglia Syndical They wrote that fascism cannot in any case be conquered in an armed struggle, but only in a legal struggle. How did that go? In July 1922, the party leader Turati begged the king to stop the fascists, the very same king who then handed power to Mussolini a few months later. In Germany, there was even more ample opportunity to defeat the Nazis. The German working class was the most powerful, most organized in the entire world. I mean, the military organizations, just the military organizations of the KPD and the SPD, numbered millions. They were a lot bigger than the SA. The Reichsbanner, the military front of the SPD, Social Democracy, had 3 million members organized into more than 5,000 groups with access to arms. They could have smashed the Nazis easily, but the leaders refused to use that strength. Like the Italian Socialist Party, the SPD placed their hopes in the state to stop Hitler. I mean, the reformists, they just repeat the same sayings over and over again. Erich Ollenhauer, who fled in 1933 and therefore has survived, he became the party leader in 1952. He said that the use of the vote is the only way to fight fascism, which is in line with the traditions of social democracy. Important to hold on to traditions. I would agree if the traditions are good. Well, that vote was used to pave the way for Hitler by supporting everything and everyone as the lesser evil to Hitler. Even before the rise of fascism, they entered into coalition governments with bourgeois parties after the elections in 1928. They had supported bourgeois governments before that. But most criminal, they supported the Brüning government after the 1930 elections. The elections where I think the Nazis went from being the smallest party in the Bundestag to the second largest one. And those social democrats who raised objections to supporting Brüning, they were expelled from the party. Then in 1932, in the presidential elections, they decided not to stand a candidate and instead support the arch-reactionary Hindenburg as the lesser evil to Hitler. The same Hindenburg that they said in 1925 was the bigger evil. The same Hindenburg, like the king in Italy, who then appointed Hitler as chancellor. In this way, the social democracy allowed the Nazis to more and more appear as the real opposition, and them as an arm of the government attacking the poor. Even when Hitler became chancellor, they refused to act, arguing, no, this appointment is constitutional. A bit like the left in Brazil, I think, that when Bolsonaro won, shouting about, oh no, it will be fascism. But then afterwards, when he won, we have to respect the results of the election. We cannot say fora Bolsonaro, no. Even after the full seizure of power was complete, they kept this line of least resistance, adapting to Hitler to not provoke him. The trade unions did the same. None of it saved them or helped them in any way, besides some leaders who managed to flee. Many of them were slaughtered all the same, on the streets in those first months, or in the concentration camps. Now, the Communist Party could have played an entirely different role. They could have made all the difference. They did struggle against the fascists. Unlike the SPD, they did not plead to the state to save them from fascism. But just like all those people today who say everything can be fascism, they also called everyone fascist. And in that way, they played down the real danger posed by Hitler. And most criminally, they said that the main threat was not Hitler, but the SPD, the social fascists, as they call them. Trotsky, in this period, he published one article after another, arguing that the Communist Party should take the initiative for a united front, a fighting arrangement between the trade unions, the Communist Party, and the SPD, take up the struggle against the Nazis, help protect each other's meetings and demonstrations. The KPD refused. They're social fascists, the reformists, we can't. We're only with the rank and file, but basically the rank and file just have to come over to us and become communists first. And they were so obsessed with this idea of defeating the Social Democrats that on several occasions they collaborated instead with the fascists in breaking up social democratic meetings. I mean, they wrote about this openly, inciting communist workers to attack social democratic workers, and not just workers, but youth and children, telling the small children, go beat up the social democratic children in the kindergartens. And in this way, I mean, they were never able to substantially win over the working class that was following the SPD. I mean, it's like I said, it's hard to win over sections of the working class by calling them racists and fascists. It's even more difficult if you beat them up together with Nazis. And in this way, the German working class was unable to fight back. And what we see is this calling everything fascism, but even more so lesser evilism, is a recipe to pave the way for the victory of the bigger evil. And that does increase the danger of fascist attacks. Even if Trump, Meloni and so on are not real fascists, the amount of racist fear-mongering that they spew out, and not just them, I mean more or less all politicians these days, and the media for that matter, that emboldens real fascists, real fascist organizations, like the English Defence League or the Nordic resistance movement in Scandinavia. And the combination of the poverty, the deindustrialization, the lack of a future facing young people, the anger and embitterment that this has bred, and all the politicians blaming this on immigrants who are stealing the jobs and housing, that are costing society money, therefore we have to carry out cuts. All these lies is leading to increased racism and the kind of racist attacks that we've seen in Southampton, Belfast and South Africa recently. And that means fighting real fascists is put on the agenda, even if the actual fascists, even participating in these kind of riots, are very small numbered. They can wreak a lot of havoc when unanswered. So how do you fight them? Well, it's high time to learn the lessons of the past. It's not by appealing to the police for protection, which is precisely what the former leader of the Left Party in Sweden, Jonas Sjöstedt, did. And there was a wave of fascist rallies and attacks in Sweden in 2014 to 2017. He said it's the task of the police to defend people against attacks from the fascists. Now, what were the police doing when he said this? They were helping the fascists in attacking the counter-demonstrations. They were protecting the fascists, who were tiny and needed the protection of the police. For example, in Malmö, in August 2014, 6 Nazis gathered for a rally. They were running for elections. I think you can guess, they didn't do very well. And they were protected by 400 police that had been drawn in from all over the country and Denmark. I mean, they were heavily armed. They had helicopters, horses, armed vehicles. I mean, it was like they had prepared for warfare. The counter-demonstration of 2000, very peaceful and calm, it was viciously attacked by the police, who just rode in with horses, first trampling people. I mean, there was images of them just beating people up, drawing them in and then beating them. And just driving in with the armed vehicles, stopping ambulances from getting through to help people, and harassing people at the hospital. If there's anyone listening who have illusions in the Swedish state, this is the Swedish police and the state. But there were many other similar incidents in those years. Fascist rallies, but also attacks. They set fire to immigrant residences. And what finished off that wave of fascist attacks were the mass demonstrations mobilized against them. Again and again, the Nazis gathered a handful and were met by thousands or tens of thousands. The culmination was in 2017 when the Nordic resistance movement, they mobilized all over Scandinavia. They had hoped to gather 1,000 Nazis in Gothenburg. Instead, they got 300, and they were met by 20,000 who blocked their march and forced them to retreat, which led to the collapse of that organization. I mean, it was very funny to read the comments on the Nazi social media after that. They were so depressed. And I think I looked at their website not a few years ago, and all you could see was like reports from activities by these older men with kids complaining about how people don't really turn up. And all they seemed to do was head out in the forest, do some workouts, swim in cold water, and then have a barbecue with their wives and children. That's what 2017 in Gothenburg did to them. You demoralize Nazis. You show them the real balance of forces. And when you are faced with the kind of violence that we saw in Belfast, you do like the brave people of Minneapolis did. You organize neighborhood committees. You alert each other when to come out in force, to protect each other and drive the thugs out. Arm yourselves with pots and pans if necessary. That's how you fight fascists. Mass demonstrations to show the real balance of forces, drive them out from streets and neighborhoods, and occasionally you need to, as Trotsky put it, acquaint them with the pavement. It's not by exaggerating the strength of fascism, by calling everything fascism, that makes you take this threat seriously. It's really not. It's the other way around. It only leads to the worst kind of pessimism and confusion, and really the most unserious methods. I came across an extreme example of this on Instagram. It was this cute little post, how do we call it, a slide? No, not a story, but like... Yeah, carousel. With nice little, cute little flowers. And the first picture said, "Fascism is here." A guide to caring for mind, body and community. Someone wants to see it later, I can show you. I'll just give a few examples from the guide. So one advice was build grounding rituals. Step away before fear consumes you. Move your body in ways that helps release tension. Collective care is the antidote to fascism. No, this is not the antidote to fascism. This person clearly understands absolutely nothing about what fascism is and how to fight it. And I mean, we laugh now, but actually it fills me with rage. I used to work at a Jewish elder care home, and many of the older ladies, they had been in concentration camps. One of them had the numbers from Auschwitz. Imagine telling this. It's disgusting. And my grandmother grew up in Nazi Germany, so I know the stories. And what is the real core advice given here? Retreat into yourself, give up, lie in bed, pull the covers up, take care of yourself, maybe lie under the bed, cowering. And maybe the bad times will pass, all the bad things will go by and you haven't been affected. And this might be extreme, but this kind of confusion and pessimism dominates the left. Oh, racism is everywhere, fascism is won, it's all over. They're so pessimistic because they forget, again, there isn't just one class in this society. There is another class that has proved its capability of fighting time and time again. And they're so pessimistic that they cannot see that actually the working class is more able and more ready to fight than ever before. It's bigger than ever before. Back in the 30s, the working class were in a minority in more or less all countries. Maybe in all countries. Don't know about Britain. The peasantry was a majority, even in advanced capitalist countries. This is what allowed the capitalists to fund this mass movement against the working class. But today, the working class is a crushing majority in all advanced capitalist countries, and it's grown massively all over the world. The peasants have almost disappeared in Europe and the US. The last peasant in my family was a few generations ago. She had to work as an assistant nurse and carry for the land, and then she went bankrupt. And there are middle layers, a middle class if you will, but many of the professions that were very privileged back in the days had this very like, oh, I'm so much better attitude, often hostile towards the labour movement. Teachers, nurses, civil servants. Back then, quite a few of them became fascists. Quite a lot of students who were generally back then from wealthy backgrounds became students, or became fascists. They were students. And this is no longer the case. They are now part of the working class, or much closer to it. And sectors like teachers and nurses have proved their militancy in the last years. So you cannot have a repeat of exactly what happened in the 30s and the 20s. And since 2011, we've seen wave after wave of class struggle and revolutions in one country after another. So it's not fascism that is on the agenda, it's revolution. And we are still in the beginning of that revolutionary process. The US has not had its third revolution yet. It will. Most countries are still heading towards revolution. Now, of course, at some point, if the working class cannot manage to take power, a day will come when this revolutionary period will be over, at least temporarily, and it won't be a repeat of the 30s, but it will be brutal. There will be dictatorships, bloody counter-revolutions. Some countries have already gotten a taste of it. And that's a warning that we must not waste time. We have to organize, not fighting for a lesser evil, this constant hamster wheel, or for self-care as an antidote to fascism. No, we have to fight for a revolution, because the world is not going fascist, but we could make it go communist.
Okay, thank you so much, Ylva, for that wonderful presentation. So yes, I'm gonna try to fit in a couple speakers before we go on break. And the first speaker will be Tom Trottier from the Revolutionary Communists of America.
Thank you, Ylva. That was an excellent lead off.
Sorry, followed by Nanny from Spain.
You explained that in the United States, the capitalist state has had a long history of repression and violence. And yet the US government has never been fascist. Certainly, if you look at the last 150 years of American history, you wouldn't see examples of a mass fascist movement. There were times like the 1920s and 1930s when the Ku Klux Klan and fascist groups were larger than they are today, but it wasn't a mass fascist movement. In the end, the capitalists did not need to resort to fascism in order to maintain its rule in the United States. And the size and the power of the working class also drove these elements to retreat and hide. Now, as the comrade explained, many people on the left refer to Trump and MAGA as fascist. But at best, they're using that term fascist as a political swear word. It's not an accurate scientific explanation of what MAGA is. MAGA is simply a slogan that Trump used to develop his movement, which was an electoral movement to get him elected president. MAGA itself doesn't have it's not organized politically as an actual organization. And there's certainly no armed detachments of MAGA. There are fascist groups in the United States. Some of them are armed. I can't imagine there's more than several thousand of those in a country of 340 million people. There's also groups that exist like the TP USA, Turning Point USA. Some people say that's fascist. That's the organization that was founded by the late Charlie Kirk. That's a right-wing reactionary organization, but it's not a fascist organization. They don't have armed detachments. They don't break up strikes, protests, workers' meetings. They supported Trump, and before Trump, they supported Republicans. It's actually a very well-funded organization. They had, in 2024, they got $114 million in revenue, and they spent only part of that, $104 million they spent on their various political activities. And who funds these? Big capitalist magnates. There's a casino magnate named Steve Wynn. He gives a lot of money to them. There's a lot of hedge fund managers give them money. But none of these people, none of these capitalists feel that a fascist required it. This is just funding right-wing propaganda. Then you also have other people who are called fascists, like Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson. Who are these people? They're basically media figures. They have podcasts. They have a lot. They may have a lot of people who watch and listen to what they say, but none of them have formed actual political organization nor armed political organization. Another thing that comes up on the question of Trump and fascism is the question of what happened on January 3rd, 2020 when people went into the US Capitol. Now, what happened on that day was there was a rally for Trump of about 30 to 40,000 people in Washington, D.C. And 30 to 40,000 people is not a lot in the United States, especially to support a sitting president. Inside that crowd, some of those people were fascists, but not the whole 30, 40,000. They marched to the Capitol, and several thousand, not the whole crowd, but several thousand actually went into the Capitol. The reason they got into the Capitol was it wasn't properly guarded by the police. If the left had a demonstration of only 10,000 people that went by the Capitol, they'd have an army around it. So some of these people breached the Capitol, and then eventually they brought reinforcements with the police and they got them out. If it was a fascist coup, remember that Donald Trump was the president of the United States at that time. He was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. He did nothing to help these people or to keep, to allow them to hold on to the Capitol. And these people were removed. Now, later, when he was reelected a couple of years ago, he did pardon these people who had been prosecuted by the state. But Trump was did not stay in office that first term. He left as he was supposed to leave. If that's fascism, then it's very easy to remove fascism. Now, I think we have to say, look, if fascism was ruling in the United States right now, you wouldn't be able to go on the street and sell a communist newspaper. You wouldn't be able to hold public meetings, which we do. We would not be able to demonstrate publicly like we do. And in fact, there were these mass protests all across the country against Trump, recently called No Kings. Somebody came up to me at that demonstration and said, "Aren't you worried about fascism?" I said, if there was fascism, this demonstration would not be allowed today. He said I made a good point. Now, what happened in Minneapolis with the attack of the ICE, we should understand what exactly happened there. Trump has expanded the police force that deals with immigrants, called ICE, and he's made it much more aggressive against the population. And that aggressiveness, you saw, they killed people who were protesting. But that created a mass movement against ICE. And in the end, who won that battle? It was the people. Even without proper leadership, the balance of forces was on the side of the working class. Trump had to remove a significant force of ICE away from Minneapolis, and he had to get rid of two of their chiefs, Nome and Bovino. Now, I just wanted to give a little historical example of what repression can be like in the United States in the past. Now, I think it's May 13th, 1985. There was a group called MOVE in Philadelphia, and they had a house. The members of the group were Black Americans, and the city was trying to extract these people from the house. After failing to do that, the Philadelphia police, on the orders of the mayor, they dropped a bomb on that house. They destroyed 61 houses in that neighborhood, which was a black neighborhood. They killed 6 adults and 5 children. The mayor of Philadelphia was Wilson Goode, a liberal Democrat, and also black, by the way. Now, there was a picture the next day in the New York Times that showed the devastation in that neighborhood. It looked like it was a war zone. Now, when the liberal Democrats do that, nobody said, "Oh, that's fascism." But I think if something like that happened today under Trump, I think that would get a different label. Look, comrades, as Marx says, sometimes the revolution needs the whip of reaction. The rise of right-wing reaction and fascism can cause a massive upswing in working class activity. We are 100% against fascism. We want to eliminate the possibility of fascism ever coming back. And there's only one way to do that. You have to get rid of capitalism. Because only a democratically planned economy, a socialist economy, can eliminate any threat of going down that road. And it's the working class taking power that'll get us to socialism. And in order for that to happen, we need a party, and we have to build it.
Okay, we have Nanny from Spain.
Right, comrades, Spain was the only country, and with Italy and Germany, where you actually had fascism.
Pero el fascismo español tuvo características muy diferentes, ¿no? Italia y Alemania.
But Spanish fascism had some distinct characteristics from Italy and
Que
Germany.
realmente en España jamás el fascismo pudo desarrollar un movimiento auténticamente de masa.
¿Por qué en España? Because Spain never really managed to develop a authentic mass movement.
No porque la clase obrera española fuera más inteligente o valiente que la italiana y alemana, para nada, en absoluto.
Not because the working class in Spain was particularly smarter or sneakier than the Italian working class,
Sino justamente porque conociendo la experiencia en Italia, en Alemania y en Austria, la clase obrera española se lanzó de una manera muy combativa a impedir por cualquier medio que el fascismo tomara el poder. En el
but
país.
precisely because they saw the experience in Italy and in Germany that they put up a real fight to avoid the rise of fascism.
Hasta el punto de convocar una huelga general revolucionaria en octubre del 34, que duró una semana,
To the point that they called for a revolutionary general strike in October of 1934 to prevent the rise of fascism.
con la toma del poder, ¿no?, en la cuenca minera asturiana durante 2 semanas,
With the taking of power in Asturias,
que cortó toda posibilidad de que el fascismo se mostrara como omnipresente, omnipotente. La clase obrera apareció ofreciendo una guía para transformar la situación.
which cut through this illusion of fascism looking as all-powerful, as imminent.
De hecho, la desesperación de la burguesía por aplastar a la clase obrera llevó al nivel que el alzamiento de Franco fue simplemente un golpe militar clásico, no un golpe fascista movilizando a millones en las calles.
In fact, the bourgeois was so desperate to stop the workers that the rise of Franco to power was more like a traditional coup and like a dictatorship than it was a fascist movement.
Y aún así este golpe fue derrotado en las partes más importantes del Estado español también a través de la acción revolucionaria de las masas.
And even then, this coup was actually defeated in key places in the Spanish state through revolutionary struggle.
Lamentablemente, como bien explicó Ilva, las direcciones obreras, ¿no?, desde los estalinistas hasta los anarquistas y los comunistas, hicieron todo lo posible para frustrar esta revolución, ¿no?, y condujeron a su derrota sangrienta.
Unfortunately, like Ilva's already explained, it was the leadership, the anarchists, the POUM, that failed to take power, and it ended in a bloodbath.
De tal manera que el fascismo español nunca tuvo el carácter plebeyo, por decirlo así, que tuvo en algún momento en Italia y en Alemania, sino que siempre fue un movimiento de la pequeña burguesía adinerada, de los ricos.
So you have this instance in Spain where fascism doesn't really have like a peasant element to it, but it more so is for the wealthier, petty bourgeois. It's fascism for the rich.
Y eso ha sido así hasta la fecha, ahora son sectas, ¿no?, irrelevantes.
And to this day, that's the case. They're irrelevant sects.
Y es interesante, ¿no?, porque es cierto que, como en otros países, ha habido un auge, ¿no?, de bandas fascistas, ¿no?, de tratar de reemerger, ¿no?, después de los años 70, ¿no?, donde tuvieron también una cierta actividad.
And it's interesting because, like everywhere else, you do have this rise in activity from the far right. There's this revival, like there was in the 70s, of fascist activity.
Lo que vemos en España es lo que estamos viendo en todos los países, ¿no? Allí donde hacen intentos por aparecer, hay una reacción instintiva, sobre todo de la juventud revolucionaria, por intentar combatirlos en la calle.
So what we see in Spain is same as everywhere else. Wherever they try to appear, there's a huge reaction, especially from the youth, and they try to stop them.
En España hay un agitador ultraderechista que se llama Vito Quiles,
In Spain, there's a far-right agitator called Vito Quiles,
que quería ser el Charlie Kirk español sin que lo mataron.
He wanted to be Spanish Charlie Kirk
Sin que lo maten.
without getting shot.
Y el año pasado organizó una gira por todas las universidades españolas, ¿no?, para hacer mítines de masa reaccionarios, ¿no?, contra la inmigración, el comunismo, etc.
And last year, he organized a tour of all the universities across the Spanish state where he wanted to have rallies racist rallies against immigration, against communism.
financiado por empresarios, como él mismo ha reconocido.
He himself admits that he's backed by big companies.
Y en todas las universidades donde aparecía, nunca pudo hacer ningún meeting.
And in every university he turned up in, he could never actually carry out these rallies.
Porque cientos y miles de estudiantes se agrupaban espontáneamente para bloquear, ¿no? Impedir, digamos, esa actividad, por lo cual fue un fracaso.
Because hundreds and thousands of students would gather to block him from having his activities, and it always failed.
Por ejemplo, ahora los nazis en España se han unificado en un solo partido que se llama Núcleo Nacional.
So now all the Nazis in Spain have actually come together in a party called the National Nucleus.
Quiere decir que nosotros tenemos una experiencia directa, ¿no? En el combate, ¿no? Contra este grupo.
I must say we have direct experience with interacting with this group, with fighting against it.
Porque en el mes de enero anunciaron públicamente en su red social que iban a abrir una sede en Barcelona.
Because in January they announced that they were going to open an office in Barcelona.
Entonces nuestros camaradas en Barcelona tomaron la iniciativa de contactar al resto de grupos de la izquierda revolucionaria local para organizar una contramanifestación y tratar de bloquear ese acto.
So the comrades took the initiative of contacting all the other left organizations and have a counter-protest to block them from actually getting to their office.
En su red social no se atrevieron a decir el lugar donde iban a hacer su acto los nazis.
In their social media, they didn't dare to actually announce the exact location of where they were going to meet.
Decían, lo diremos el día antes.
They said, we'll announce it the day before.
Pero no, llegó el día y no dijeron nada hasta que finalmente dijeron, lo diremos una hora antes de que empiece.
But
Va a ser el lugar.
it was 24 hours before the event. They didn't say anything, and then they said, no, we'll actually announce it an hour before.
Refleja el pánico, el miedo, ¿no? ¿Dónde está la real correlación de fuerzas en el combate entre los fascistas y los antifascistas?
And it really showed the panic that they had, the fear of the real relation of the balance of forces.
Al final se concentraron 1000 antifascistas en la plaza de Cataluña, ¿no? En Barcelona, porque no sabíamos dónde iban a hacer el evento.
In the end, you had 1,000 anti-fascists demonstrating in the square in Barcelona, and we didn't actually know where they were actually meeting.
Y finalmente ellos anunciaron que se reunían en un pueblo a 30 kilómetros de Barcelona.
But then they had to say that instead they were meeting in a little village 30 kilometers away from Barcelona,
En un polígono industrial abandonado
in a worn-down industrial estate,
y rodeado de cientos de policías.
and surrounded by thousands of police.
Lo celebraron como un éxito. Lo hemos hecho, lo hemos podido hacer.
And they presented this as a success. They were like, well, we were able to have our rally.
Voy a decir otra cosa sobre esto. Bueno, quiero ir rápidamente, no tengo tiempo para hablar de Vox.
Quickly, I don't have much time to talk about Vox.
Bueno, Vox comparte, ¿no? Las mismas características, ¿no? De otros grupos de la extrema derecha nacionalista, ¿no? Y racista.
Vox shares similar characteristics with all the other people we've mentioned, with these racist, nationalist, right-wing people.
A diferencia de otros grupos, Vox es una escisión del PP, no es un grupo que sale nuevo.
Unlike other formations, this is actually a split from the right-wing party, the PP. So it's not a new formation.
Y emergió con fuerza después de que el Partido Popular perdiera el gobierno a manos del PSOE.
And it came out very strong after the PP, Partido Popular, lost to the left, to PSOE.
Un año más tarde, ¿no? Desde que el proceso revolucionario en Cataluña, ¿no? Fuera derrotado.
A year later, after the defeat of the revolutionary process in Catalonia.
También un año, 2 años después de toda, digamos, la frustración con que Podemos trajera un auténtico cambio en el país.
And like a year later of all this frustration of being unable to bring about change.
O sea, comparte estas mismas características, ¿no? De la frustración con un cambio radical de la situación, ¿no?
So
Y la crisis de la derecha tradicional.
It shares that similarities of the crisis of the traditional right wing and this frustration that is looking for a way out.
Bueno, hay que decir que Vox también tiene características diferentes, ¿no? Con otros
There are some differences with Vox.
O sea, Vox tiene una clara raíz pequeño burguesa en su composición social, ¿no? De sus dirigentes, ¿no? Y de su base social de apoyo.
Vox's base and origins are actually from the petty bourgeois. Their leaders are petty bourgeois.
Pequeños propietarios, ¿no? Que viven de la mano de obra inmigrante en el campo, en la hostelería.
Small landowners that live out of immigrant labor.
El aparato del Estado, policías, guardias civiles.
From the state apparatus, there are policemen, there are civil
Por
servants.
supuesto recibe votos, ¿no? De trabajadores atrasados, desesperados, pero no tiene una impronta plebeya.
And of course, it receives the support from very desperate elements of the working class, but it doesn't have that peasant and like base.
Además, Vox tiene ya una existencia de 8 años. Es un partido fresco, joven, ¿no? Como puede haber aparecido Chega en Portugal, inicialmente Meloni en Italia, ¿no? O la AfD, ¿no? En Alemania.
And Vox now has been around for 8 years, so it can't even present itself as a new formation and as a fresh party like Meloni did in Italy or Chega in Portugal.
Es un partido antiabortista, defiende a Trump, a Netanyahu, a Israel, no son credenciales muy positivas para crecer en la clase obrera española.
It's an anti-abortion party. It supports Trump. It defends Netanyahu. It defends Israel. So it's not a party for the working class at all.
Por lo cual es un partido ya odiado por millones de trabajadores y de jóvenes.
And because of that, it's already hated by thousands of workers and youth.
En estos años su apoyo electoral oscila entre el 10 y el 15%, el 16%.
Right now, it oscillates between 10 to 16% approval in the opinion
O
poll.
sea, nunca ha superado ese margen, ¿no? Hay un límite muy definido, ¿no? En su crecimiento en la clase trabajadora.
There's a
En
very,
mi opinión, obviamente.
in my opinion, there's a very hard limit to the growth it can have within the working class.
Lo más importante, y con esto termino, es
And I'll finish
que
with this.
el Vox tiene interés en ir en coalición con el Partido Popular, la derecha tradicional, y viceversa.
Is that Vox and the Partido Popular, with the traditional right wing, have an interest in each other in keeping on the coalition.
Las únicas 2 veces que la derecha ha triunfado electoralmente en España en los últimos 30 años, lo ha hecho con una imagen centrista, moderada.
The only 2 times that the right wing has gotten into power in Spain in the last 30 years, it presents itself as a center formation.
Como yo decía ayer, ¿no? Va a ser un gobierno impopular desde el primer día, también porque en la izquierda, digamos, hay mucha frustración, ¿no? Es probable que haya una abstención importante, ¿no?
Like I said, it's going to be a very unpopular government from the get-go, because there's already so much frustration and ferment in the left.
Un
As
gobierno de
well.
ataques sociales y democráticos, también contra las minorías nacionales.
Austerity, crackdown, and racism is to be expected.
O sea que si los izquierdistas hablan, ¿no? De que va a triunfar el fascismo en España, van a tener una idea muy clara de lo que es el fascismo, ¿no?
So if the left is talking about fascism getting to power in Spain, they actually have a clearer idea of what fascism is.
Pero lo que va a ocurrir no va a ser el establecimiento del fascismo, sino realmente un estallido de consecuencias, digamos, poderosísimas a nivel social.
But what you will have is not actually fascism, but this huge explosion with huge social consequences.
Se va a poner al día, digamos, una lucha por la politización acelerada y radicalizada de millones de obreros y de jóvenes, ¿no? Una situación realmente muy entusiasmante la que nos espera.
Which will put class struggle and the radicalization of youth and workers back on the agenda. So this is a very exciting period ahead for us.
Well, comrades, it is already difficult for a French person to speak without mentioning a strike. But I'm going to do something even more painful, speak several minutes about Marine Le Pen. Because the National Rally, or RN, has never been so close to power in France. Marine Le Pen could win the presidential election next year. Of course, that would be a serious danger for the working class. But does this mean that France is going fascist, as pretty much the entire left says, even Mélenchon's party, France Insoumise? We don't think so. And this is not just a question of words. An incorrect analysis leads to an incorrect strategy. From a Marxist point of view, fascism is a mass movement based mainly on the petty bourgeoisie, used by the ruling class to crush the working class organizations. Let's be clear, that's not what the RN is. It's a bourgeois electoral machine, nationalist, racist, and extremely reactionary, but not fascist. More importantly, the French working class has not suffered a decisive defeat and has shown its strength many times in the recent period. This does not minimize the danger. An RN government would attack immigrants and defend capitalist interests, but its rise does not mean that millions of workers have become fascists. The RN has grown because of the capitalist crisis, the collapse of the traditional parties, and the betrayals of reformism. For decades, socialist governments imposed austerity, privatizations, and attacks on labor rights. So millions of workers concluded that nobody represented them anymore. The RN exploits this anger through anti-establishment rhetoric and social demagogy. For example, Marine Le Pen promised retirement at 60 for many workers, even if before the 2024 election, Jordan Bardella, the leader of the RN, said that repealing Macron's pension reform was no longer a priority. Here lies the central contradiction of the RN. It must promise reforms to the workers in order to win their votes, while sending the message to the bourgeoisie that it will defend profits and private property. Marine Le Pen's conviction also strengthened her anti-establishment reputation. Like Trump, she said that judges wanted to prevent millions from voting for her. She is now allowed to stand next year in the presidential election. This shows clearly that the workers' movement cannot rely on the bourgeois state and judiciary to stop the RN, as many reformists say today. The RN redirects anger from the capitalists and towards immigrants and Muslims. But the truth is that the entire ruling class and its state, not just the RN, spread racism. Macron also has never been a barrier against the RN. For example, his government passed in 2023 an immigration law taken from the RN's program. Last year, the government organized mass roundups of undocumented migrants, and Macronists, the traditional right, and the RN voted together for the so-called license to kill law for police officers just a few weeks ago. This is the context of what we call the Republican Front, which is the policy by which the left withdraws its candidates or supports any bourgeois candidate facing the RN. In 2024, France Insoumise candidates even withdrew in favor of Macronist ministers facing the RN in the election. Mélenchon is quite funny because he says that it does not call for a vote for the right, but only for the defeat of the RN. Mélenchon. But when only the right and the RN remain in the second round, that distinction has no practical meaning. And more importantly, this allows the RN to claim that every other party supports the same system. The so-called Republican Front may have blocked the RN for years, but it prepares its future victories, especially since Mélenchon allied with the Socialist Party, not once, but twice in the recent years. This allows the RN to say, oh, you see, Mélenchon is like the other, he makes alliances with them, with the system, with the parties that betrayed you. We are the only real opposition. France, nevertheless, has something that many countries don't. A rather strong left reformist alternative in Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And millions see Mélenchon as the best way to fight the right, the far right, and austerity. French society is polarizing to the right, but also to the left. That's why we say that Mélenchon and France Insoumise must break with the Republican Front strategy and break with the right wing of reformism, especially the Socialist Party. But Mélenchon's program cannot solve the social problems that are driving the workers towards the RN. As Lenin explained, the national question is fundamentally a question of bread. The RN says there are not enough jobs, houses, or public services. And the logic is, so we must reduce immigration. Mélenchon opposes the RN's racism, but only partially rejects this logic because he still accepts restrictions on immigration. But above all, his program cannot end the shortages on which racist demagogy feeds. Only by breaking with capitalism we can provide jobs, housing, and public services for everyone. That is why, while giving Mélenchon critical support, we are building the French section of the RCI, the Parti communiste révolutionnaire. The decisive question is not, is France going fascist? It is, who will give political expression to the hunger running through society? The RN, and let's not forget the other parties of the bourgeoisie, wants to turn that hunger against immigrants. Our task is to build a party that will turn that hunger against the capitalist class and fight for socialism. Thank you.
After Rocco, we will have Johan.
I want to talk about the AfD in Germany. Ilva explained what a mass movement of the petty bourgeois, fascist gangs that physically attack the workers' organization. It's easy to see that the AfD is not that, even though the AfD is a reactionary party, and you have some fascist elements in that party. But in the eyes of many workers, the AfD is the only party that is seriously fighting against the establishment. It appears to offer an alternative to the capitalist constant attacks on the working class standard of living. But the AfD can only maintain this image because the leadership of the left party has betrayed the working class. The reformist betrayal led to the rise of right-wing populists. The left party was founded in 2007. It was an expression of the masses' desire to fight back against the attacks of the capitalist class. East Germany had been completely deindustrialized, mass unemployment rates and so on. And the SPD, the traditional party of the working class, openly carried out attacks against the working class. It created Europe's largest low-wage sector in Germany. And at the same time, the war in Afghanistan was raging on. And the left party was the only opposition to it in Germany. So the founding of the left party was a step forward in the class struggle because the masses wanted to fight. But in the years that followed, the left party put the brakes on the class struggle. It joined local governments, for example, and just one example, in Berlin, it implemented harsh austerity program. The government cut about a quarter of the budget in the 2000s, and it privatized public housing, which is a problem in Berlin. And in Thuringia, another state, where the left party was a dominant force for years and was part of the government, leading the government, now the AfD is the dominant force because of what the left party. So the working class was disappointed by the left party. And at the same time, the AfD was founded in 2013. In the beginning, primarily as an anti-European Union party. And the ruling class immediately attacked this party because they could not allow a party to exist alongside the ruling class traditional party, the conservatives. But the daily attacks against the AfD by the bourgeois press did not weaken the party. It actually strengthened it because the AfD did not cave in against it. And while the left party, on the other hand, actually repeatedly begged to cooperate with the establishment. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the left party could have fought for workers' control over the factories, but it only cautiously voiced some criticism. The unions at the time, the trade unions at the time, called off all wage struggle. They called off wage struggles, so no fight at all. And so the AfD was the only visible opposition at that time. Another important event, another shock to the consciousness was the Ukraine war. And although the left party opposes arms deliveries to the Ukraine, it nevertheless still basically views Russia as the main enemy rather than the German ruling class. So again, only the AfD fundamentally opposes this war. And this is interesting because the AfD is actually in favor of further militarization of Germany. But at the present time, currently it says we are against conscription. We don't want to die for Merz in the Ukraine. And at the same time, the left party voted in favor of rearmament in 2 federal states. So the AfD capitalizes on the workers' class hatred towards the rich. And it combines this anger with demagogic rhetoric against immigrants. And the AfD can only do this because the left party does not present a clear political program. The AfD tries to exploit the mood for their own purposes. And actually the AfD has obviously a reactionary and an anti-workers program. But the AfD could never crush the trade unions like the Nazis did, like Eva explained, because many trade union members are actually AfD voters themselves. So we want to fight the AfD just as we want to fight the ruling parties, and we can only do that with a correct program. And the state elections are coming up in September, and in one state in Saxony-Anhalt, the AfD is currently leading the polls with around 40%. So it might even win an absolute majority. And the left party says it wants to fight the AfD, but its only strategy is lesser evilism. So it wants to support a government led by the conservative to save democracy, while precisely such a government will continue to attack the working class. And the AfD will be able to say the left party and the establishment are one and the same. And so the left party will continue to lose support in the working class with this strategy. The left party says, we are so weak, we only get 10% in votes in the elections, and that's why we have to support the democratic party. And they say, we are so weak because society has shifted to the right. But the left party is only so weak because the reformist leadership is incapable of relying on the strengths of the working class. They're so weak because they have never dared to mobilize the working class for a real struggle. So there is no mystical shift to the right. Workers are turning to the AfD because of the mistakes of the left. And the left party wants to fight against the cuts of the Merz government, but is speaking of mobilizing, while at the same time in practice is putting on the brakes. Because in reality it doesn't want to overthrow the Merz government, because it fears that any instability will benefit the AfD. And so this kind of strategy will only lead to the AfD's further rise. And only a socialist program can point the way out of the current crisis. So only with a socialist program that fights for higher wages, for the nationalization of key industries, for the expropriation of banks, and so on. Only with such a program can we win over the workers who are now looking to the AfD, and also can win over the workers who are rightly repelled by the AfD's reactionary side. And with this combined strength, we can overthrow capitalism, and with it the AfD. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocco. So after Johan, we will have Fiona.
Some comrades might not know that even in Latin America, there are some that are being labeled as fascists by the left. And sometimes it seems like in Latin America, there's a competition who's the craziest guy that can.
Vimos a Bolsonaro, tenemos a Milei, tenemos a Abelardo, a Kast, ahora Bukele.
We had Bolsonaro, now we have Milei, Kast, Abelardo in Colombia, and now in El Salvador we have Bukele.
En El Salvador ocurrió que a partir del colapso de la izquierda por no llevar adelante un programa revolucionario.
In El Salvador, because of the defeat of the left and the inability to carry on a revolutionary struggle.
Surge un personaje que se presenta como un tipo antisistema.
You have the rise of this figure that presents himself as an anti-establishment person.
Esta es la tendencia que está pasando también en estos países que mencioné anteriormente.
And you see the trend in the countries I've listed as well.
Donde la izquierda ha gobernado pero no ha llevado a cabo las tareas del proletariado.
Where the left has gotten to power, but they actually didn't rule in the interest of the working class.
Tras eso, la izquierda reformista, que no tiene una alternativa, lo que hace es acusar de fascismo a estos líderes.
And from that, the left is out of options, and all they can do is label these people as fascist.
Pero lo cierto es que no representan en sí el fascismo.
The truth is that they don't really represent fascists.
Sino más bien lo más podrido de la democracia burguesa.
But they just represent the rottenness of the bourgeois democracy.
En El Salvador, por ejemplo, Bukele sigue manteniendo ciertas instituciones de la democracia burguesa porque le son favorables.
In El Salvador, Bukele maintains some institutions that are key for bourgeois democracy, but that's because it favors him.
Como ya dijo Ilva, que mencionó la forma en cómo nosotros debemos categorizar un régimen fascista.
And Ilva's already mentioned the importance of labeling regimes as fascist.
Lo cierto es que no hay condiciones para poder desarrollarse un régimen fascista como tal.
The truth is, in El Salvador, you can't actually have a fully fledged fascist regime.
Porque los marxistas debemos partir nuestro análisis a partir de condiciones objetivas sobre el cual se pueden desarrollar estos regímenes.
Because as Marxists, we should start from the facts and the objective conditions that would allow the way for these phenomena.
Que tienen que ver con el estado de las clases en pugna y el desarrollo de la economía como tal.
And it has to do with the class struggle, it has to do with the economy.
El sistema capitalista no cambia su régimen porque a las clases dominantes se les antoje.
The capitalist system cannot change its regime just because the ruling class wants to go ahead
Y
and
los,
do it.
y los marxistas debemos tener en cuenta siempre que el régimen de democracia burguesa es el mejor régimen para defender los intereses de la burguesía.
And Marxists should also be aware that bourgeois democracy is actually the most favorable way to sustain capitalism.
Porque ha sido perfeccionado durante décadas para esconder la explotación y la opresión de la clase trabajadora.
Because it's been tailor-made over decades to hide the actual exploitation and oppression of the working class.
Bukele, por esta misma razón, no ha desarrollado un régimen diferente al que teníamos anteriormente.
And that's why Bukele hasn't particularly established a different regime from what we had previously.
Pero las activistas de izquierda y algunos dirigentes del FMLN siguen acusándolo como un fascista por basarse en un análisis superficial.
But some left elements and the left party, FMLN, actually still label him as a fascist, but that's because they have a very superficial understanding of it.
Hay algunos carruseles también graciosos de estos análisis superficiales que hacen también en las redes sociales.
We also have seen very funny Instagram posts trying to analyze the situation.
Y hay uno bastante común que es de este periodista italiano, Umberto Eco,
And there's one that's very popular from this Italian journalist, Umberto Eco.
que es como una lista que te dice cómo identificar al fascismo.
And it's a list that tells you how to identify fascism.
Pero parten de cuestiones superficiales y no del análisis marxista que debería hacerse.
But they start with very superficial things and not really deepen their understanding of it.
Algunas de las características, por ejemplo, que dicen es una exaltación de un líder personal,
One of the traits that they mention is the propping up of a strong man,
nacionalismo,
nationalism, extreme,
y un uso de los medios de comunicación exagerado.
and weaponizing the media to an extreme degree.
Y la lista es completamente superficial, nada profundo.
The list is very superficial. There's nothing profound about it.
Y a partir de esto empiezan a acusar a cualquier dirigente o a cualquier personaje como fascista.
And from here, they can start labeling everyone as a fascist.
Pero detrás de esto se encuentra la incapacidad de los dirigentes de la izquierda.
But truly, what's behind this is the inability, the bankruptcy of left leaders
Que anteriormente han engañado o frustrado a las masas trabajadoras.
that have previously betrayed or even deceived the working class.
Como ocurre en El Salvador, Colombia y Chile.
Like it happened in El Salvador, Colombia, and Chile.
Esto también es muy peligroso si nosotros nos dejamos llevar por esta campaña superficial de la izquierda.
This is very dangerous if we allow ourselves to get carried away with this, left illusions in fascism.
Porque algunas de las medidas o de las políticas que desarrollan estos personajes también han estado en los regímenes de la derecha anteriormente.
Because some of the policies that these people develop have also been implemented by previous right-wing governments.
La diferencia es que estos tipos son más descarados, son más abiertos para poder desarrollar estas políticas.
The real difference is that these people are more honest, they're more open to carry out these policies.
Por ejemplo, en El Salvador, cuando gobernó la derecha, hubo persecución política, hubo asesinatos políticos, hubo represión contra las manifestaciones.
For instance, in El Salvador, when the normal right wing was in power, you had repression, you had clamping down of protests, arrests.
E incluso dentro del gobierno, los 10 años del gobierno de la izquierda, también hubieron ciertas manifestaciones de este tipo.
And even within the government, the 10 years in which the left wing was actually in power, you had instances of this as well.
Por eso es un error, como ya lo plantea Ted Grant en su debate con Pierre Frank,
So like Ted Grant said in his debate with Pierre Frank,
definir a los regímenes solo a partir de una característica que sería la represión.
it's really wrong to describe a regime just based on repression.
Porque la represión está incluida en cualquier gobierno que venga de la clase capitalista, como ya bien dijo Lenin en sus tesis de dictadura o democracia burguesa.
Because repression is actually part of a bourgeois rule. And Lenin's already explained that as well.
Y a partir de esto, nosotros tenemos que saber navegar entre todos estos tipos de opiniones para encontrar una salida y una conexión con las masas trabajadoras.
And from this, we need to be able to navigate through all this fog so we can be able to connect.
Saber explicar bien qué es realmente una dictadura fascista y el tipo de gobierno que se puede desarrollar dentro del capitalismo en declive.
To what really is fascism and what a real fascist government is like, but also what governments are able to look like under the crisis of capitalism.
Definir bien en qué momento se puede desarrollar un gobierno o una dictadura fascista.
To really outline when it is that you can have a fascist regime.
Por ejemplo, si nos preguntamos en El Salvador si podría desarrollarse una dictadura fascista, tendríamos que responder algunas preguntas.
If we pose the question in El Salvador if this could develop into a fascist dictatorship,
Una de ellas principalmente es el estado de la clase obrera y sus organizaciones.
we would have to look at a couple of things, and starting with the state of the working class in El Salvador.
Y es cierto que la clase dominante no puede utilizar los partidos tradicionales,
And though it's true that the ruling class is unable to use the traditional parties,
eso podría ser una característica,
which could be one of the things,
pero podríamos analizar que las organizaciones de la clase obrera y la clase obrera misma no ha dado la lucha por el poder o por tomar el poder en los últimos años.
we can also outline that the working class and its organizations haven't actually waged any struggle to take power in the recent period.
No ha sufrido derrotas contrarrevolucionarias a partir de su organización por la toma del poder.
It hasn't really suffered any defeats.
Como bien explicó Ilva, esa es una de las características que tenemos que tomar en cuenta para poder analizar si estamos frente a un régimen fascista.
And that's one of the key things that Ilva was already explained is knowing fascism is
Porque los capitalistas solo pueden
on the horizon.
Porque los capitalistas solo pueden recurrir a este tipo de régimen a partir de que se han agotado las formas de lucha de la clase obrera y ellos no pueden controlarlo más.
Because the capitalists can only use this as a resource once the class struggle has exhausted itself.
Yo creo que en América Latina estas condiciones no están establecidas todavía.
I don't think this is the case in Latin America.
El movimiento obrero en muchos países que he mencionado sigue estando intacto y sus organizaciones siguen todavía puestas a luchar.
The labor movement and its organizations are still going forward, willing to fight.
No por la democracia, el Estado de Derecho y la independencia de poderes, que son el discurso que los liberales pregonan frente a este tipo de gobiernos que se están estableciendo,
And it's no thanks to bourgeois democracy, which is what the liberals are trying to claim,
sino por la transformación de sus condiciones de vida.
but because of the transformations in their living conditions.
Y ahí es donde nuestro papel se vuelve fundamental,
And this is where we come in.
porque lo que estamos viendo es una búsqueda de la clase trabajadora por una alternativa antisistema, una alternativa que logre solucionar sus problemas históricos.
Because what we see is the working class trying to look for an out of their historic problems.
Y los reformistas no han sabido llenar ese vacío.
And the reformers have been unable to fill in that vacuum.
Han traicionado una y otra vez a las clases trabajadoras.
They have betrayed the working class time and again.
Esta maldición es la que los comunistas tenemos que romper, y eso solo lo vamos a poder hacer construyendo el Partido Comunista Revolucionario en todos los países de América Latina.
The communists have to break this curse, but we can only do so by building revolutionary communist parties everywhere.
Y por supuesto en todo el mundo, y yo estoy completamente seguro que lo vamos a lograr.
And I know we'll achieve it.
Adelante, camaradas.
So after Fiona, we will have Jack from Britain.
So fascism says something about the state of the class struggle. It says something about the strength of the working class. That is why, as communists, we have to be precise about what exactly it is. And we've heard about the historical conditions that give rise to it. And we know that fascism coming to power is not a serious prospect in most countries because of the balance of class forces. However, it doesn't require an enormous fascist movement to be on the scene for it to be a very serious question in the minds of young people and workers. One of the main messages we receive as the RCP in Britain on why people want to join us and why they're communists is, I want to fight the far right. And that is not just because of the left conflating everything bad with fascism. And it's not just because the liberals are constantly sounding the alarm. And I also think they're not just thinking about Nigel Farage or right-wing populists. People are responding to the avalanche of racism and real violence that they're seeing erupt and Ylva gave the examples, and we've analysed this, the pogroms in Belfast and across major different cities in Britain. Anyway. And I would say just one fascist attack, even by a lone individual, can have a massive impact on the political situation, the events that are taking place, and also consciousness. Because any time that the far right are able to mobilise in any significant way, it creates fear and division in the working class. It makes people feel isolated and distrustful of your neighbour, of someone you work with. When they're walking down the street, they're thinking, are you part of them? It creates isolation and division. Now, in September 2025, Tommy Robinson mobilised around 100,000 people in a big demonstration in London. And Tommy Robinson, historically, is a figure who's always based himself on fascist elements. So when this demonstration happened, it was a big shock. But when you looked at the makeup of the demonstration, it was a mix of people who were there. And it's important for us to understand that these were not 100,000 fascists on the streets, although there was definitely fascists there and violent elements. But if there were 100,000 fascists on the streets of London, the political situation in Britain would be very different, and the work of communists would be bigger and much more serious. But we can say that that demonstration was based on anti-immigrant sentiment, it was racist, it was nationalist, and it was reactionary. And it creates fear and division in the working class. And when things like this happen, from the point of view of the class struggle, it makes people less confident on the left. On top of this, there has been a series of small, genuinely fascist groups and demonstrations in Britain. And I'll really emphasize their real numbers are small. And when a proper counter-demonstration is called, they are always outnumbered. But we have to take every single instance as seriously as possible because it's having a big impact on consciousness. And we should explain that these fascists have been emboldened by the rise of right-wing populism. And so despite their small size, they have a disproportionate impact on what is taking place. Now, we understand as communists that the driving force for right-wing populism, whether it's Reform or Trump, the driving force is not race. You can't explain the rise of right-wing populists by solely talking about racism. It's about anti-establishment mood that exists in the working class. But obviously they wrap their anti-establishment message in racism, and it's getting worse. I think the more these right-wing populists are exposed, the more racist they become, or they use racism increasingly. Nigel Farage, after the killing of a young white man in Britain in an interaction, he blamed the police and he used the slogan "White Lives Matter." And just a week later, there was a fascist on the streets in Glasgow, and they held a banner that said "White Lives Matter." And they were attacking, stopping black and brown people in the street. So even though these are different forces and with different reasons, there's a link that is growing between them, and there's a relationship there. And there is more violence. There's a lot of horrible examples. There was an elderly Asian man who was stabbed to death by some young white kids in a park. A Sikh woman was attacked and raped with Islamophobic abuse shouted at her during the attack. You don't belong here, get out. And so all of this is happening at the same time and is being mixed up together. And as I said earlier, I think for lots of people it just feels like an avalanche. Whether it's Nigel Farage or Tommy Robinson or Elon Musk promoting all of it on Twitter. Because racism, like other ideologies, can and has taken on a logic of its own. But we have to understand in our anti-racist struggle that the intended target of racism is actually the working class itself, precisely because it weakens, it disarms, it divides and produces fear. I mean, and in regards to racism, Marx explained this a long time ago when talking about the anti-Irish racism that existed in the English working class. He described it as the impotence of the English working class, that it was holding them back. But anyway, the mistake obviously that the left makes is when they see racism, as has been explained, they become hysterical and they blame the workers. And we have nothing in common with that approach, and we are the most serious anti-racists. And we have to continuously explain that racism, racism is not the same as fascism. Not all fascist movements have used the same levels of racism. In Italy, anti-Semitism wasn't the key driving force in the same way. And we must be very clear about that. But that doesn't mean we can't connect to people who are being radicalized by racism, by racist attacks, and then also by the fascists. In fact, we must do that and then give people the tools to actually fight it.
Okay, Jack will be our last speaker before we hand it over to Ylva to wrap up. So very sorry if I could not fit you in. I had to cut 7 people. It's not personal.
Hi, comrades. So in the British section, we have just published a polemic against the Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Cliffite organisation. And through their front organisation, Stand Up to Racism, they have held a monopoly on the anti-racist movement for decades. And I believe similar organisations exist in other countries, for example, in Ireland. And they combine liberal anti-racism with lesser evilism and popular front tactics, like supporting the Labour Party. And because of this, they've led the movement into a dead end. Their authority is on the decline, leaving behind a vacuum. And we are now trying to become recognised as the revolutionary wing within this anti-racist movement in Britain. But this is a political battle which involves drawing the lessons from the SWP's mistakes. And one source of the SWP's opportunist errors is their hysteria over the question of fascism. They say, for example, that fascist parties are rapidly accelerating and growing. And by this, they mean parties like Rassemblement National, Fratelli d'Italia, and so on. And they even say that in many countries, the fascists are setting the agenda politically. And this all sounds very scary. You can almost hear the sound of approaching jackboots. But the funny thing is, the leading theoreticians of the SWP have read Leon Trotsky's writings on fascism. And they can regurgitate their main lessons in a more or less accurate manner. And they understand that fascism is a counter-revolutionary response to the threat of a workers' revolution, that fascism is based upon a petty bourgeois mass movement, and that it is set in motion by the ruling class to destroy the workers' organizations. Clearly, none of these conditions apply today, as we have discussed. And I think even they can see that. So how do they reconcile the Marxist understanding of fascism with their alarming picture of despair and reaction? They admit that Trotsky's analysis is useful, but they say that he was analyzing a specific movement of interwar fascism, or classical fascism, if you will. And things have changed since then. They say that fascist parties had to adapt and reinvent themselves and distance themselves from the fascism of the interwar period. The Front National, or Rassemblement National in France, for example, pursued an image of respectability, focusing on elections and posing as a normal party of the right. They dropped their talk of fascist goals and focused on migration and Islamophobia. And they also haven't been able to build a street movement similar to the 1930s. So we must ask, if the parties of Meloni or Le Pen have consciously distanced themselves from fascism, if they have long dropped their fascist goals, and if they are unable to build a fascist street movement, what exactly makes them fascists still? And they have no real answers, to be honest. In another article, they argue that the Trump regime in America is more than just normal authoritarianism that we can see elsewhere. They say that there is an interrelation between ICE and street-based fascist groups. And they say that ICE and the Border Patrol function as a paramilitary force and are drawing the far right into its ranks. And they cherry-pick these incidental and exaggerated links between the reactionaries, the far right, and the state. But I think that such links have always existed in many periods and in many different countries. Another thing they do to justify, suggesting that the Trump regime might be fascist is they drag in an analogy to the Horthy dictatorship in Hungary in the interwar period. Because Trotsky did refer to this regime and similar regimes like it as semi-fascist in passing, in the sense that they were developing towards fascism or they were trying to mimic the mass movements of Hitler and Mussolini. But without any elaboration whatsoever, the SWP takes this and suggests that we could maybe describe Trump's regime as semi-fascist as well. But they don't end up concluding one way or the other. And in another sign of the SWP's complete eclecticism on this matter, for some reason they don't describe the AFD as fascist. They describe it as a hybrid formation. Meanwhile, Reform UK is not fascist at all, but far right. The meaning of these nuances is completely lost to me. But missing from all of this theoretical gymnastics is any serious analysis of the social base for fascism today. They completely overlook the dramatic shift in the class balance of forces in the past century. I mean, think for 1 second what would happen if a Farage or a Le Pen or any government actually were to try and enact a fascist or a Bonapartist program. This would mean trying to annihilate or at least heavily repress parliamentary democracy, trade unions, and all left-wing organizations. As we've discussed, this would provoke unprecedented revolutionary convulsions. The movement in Minneapolis, for example, gives us a mere glimpse of what might happen. And the ruling class knows this, which is why, a fascist takeover or any attempt at a confrontation with the working class on that scale is ruled out for this period. But why is any of this relevant anyway? The SWP are a tiny organization. No one really cares about them. The point is, the common thread which runs through all of their writings and their theoretical material on fascism is an attempt to stretch the category of fascism, the label of fascism, beyond all meaning. And in the end, they can apply it to almost any reactionary, anti-working class phenomenon. And then, by using the terms fascism, racism, and far right almost interchangeably, they can paint an alarming, pessimistic picture of despair, that the forces of counter-revolution are growing and on the march everywhere. And the result of this philosophical formalism, this theoretical sleight of hand, is a completely one-sided, despairing perspective for the coming period. They completely overlook the massive radicalization to the left as well as to the right. And it's this theoretical mistake, I think, which serves as one of the political bases for their opportunism, their popular frontism, their lesser evilism. And ironically, if fascism was around the corner, as they say, the task of the working class would actually be the opposite. It would be to arm itself and prepare for a life and death struggle for revolution. But the SWP says, vote Labour and defend democracy. But I think this serves as a warning of what can happen if you have a superficial approach to Marxism. When you treat history or the writings of Trotsky, for example, as an archive of examples to cherry-pick to justify your pre-made conclusions. When you treat Marxism as a catalogue of labels and schemas and categories. And when you abandon a materialist class analysis for superficial impressionism. That's all, thanks.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion. I guess that's it. Pass it back to Ylva to wrap up.
I think it's been an excellent discussion. I hope it's clarified a lot of things watching at home. I was asked a number of questions in the break. I'll see if I have time to get to them, but I have a number of points I want to get to first. And I did answer them personally, but if you don't feel like I've answered them properly, we can continue discussing afterwards. I think both Tom and Johan raised some interesting points, important points, that are an important part of the answer to why we won't see fascism, why we're not facing fascism right now. Johan said that the ruling class prefers bourgeois democracy, and that is in particular in relation to fascism. Things did not end up very well when the ruling class agreed to hand over power to Mussolini and in particular Hitler, because they did not control them. I mean, Hitler also threw some capitalists into jail. He killed a few. And he made a lot of mistakes that were really ruinous for the ruling class in the Second World War, but that they were unable to stop him from doing, which led to the monumental defeat for Germany in the Second World War when taking up the struggle against the Red Army. I mean, he was a madman. And in a bourgeois democracy, there's so many different mechanisms that the bourgeoisie can use to stop a madman, to remove them or at least contain them. I think this is the lessons of the 30s. Even if I don't think I don't know what the capitalists believe, I don't care. But I don't think they necessarily view Trump as like Hitler. But I do think this attitude amongst a section of the ruling class towards Trump or the AfD, it bears this kind of memory of what happens when we have someone in power who thinks more about themselves and their own ideas. And so they're very hesitant, scared. But also they have mechanisms to contain Trump in ways that they didn't with Hitler, precisely because it's still bourgeois democracy. And also, I mean, there's an element that I didn't have time to go into, and I don't think I have time to go into it now either. But Jordi talked about it yesterday. That there is part of Trump in particular, but also the shift that Trump wanted to make in regards to US imperialism and where its focus should be, that does reflect the genuine interests of the US ruling class. And that the Democrats are representing this part of the ruling class that is clinging to old positions that are no longer possible. But anyway, I think what Tom also said, that the US ruling class didn't need fascism. Also, they don't need fascism today, and it would be a very, very bad thing for them, because the main pillar of stability in capitalism at the present time is precisely the aim of fascism to annihilate it. It's the labor movement, it's the trade unions, containing, policing the working class. If they started to go too far in the direction of dictatorship or anything, they're not convinced they're going to win. That's part of the reason why the austerity, I know we've seen quite a lot of austerity, but nothing in comparison to what was really needed since 2008. They've been stopped time and time again, had to put a brake on it, because the working class has responded powerfully. France is the best example of that. Yes, that's one thing. I think also Nani he made a really interesting contribution. And I think he spoke to something that also Jack raised, which I think maybe can confuse some people. Okay, so you've just said fascism is this. And then Nani says, well, they never really had a genuine mass movement. But then how can we say what is fascism and what isn't? Maybe there can be loads of different versions with this little element and that little element. And I think first of all we should listen to Ted Grant. He said, what dictates the nature of a regime is not this or that element, but its basic features. The Marxist method is not to lump all regimes indiscriminately together. That is the easy way, but it will lead to blunders and confusion. The Marxist method is to examine things in their process of change and evolution, to examine each government in turn, to establish its specific features and tendencies. I think you can make a mistake as a Marxist. You start with a correct definition of, say, fascism, then you look for parties or movements in history or today that resemble or fit in with the abstract definition of fascism. And if enough seems to fit, the conclusion is this must be fascism, but also the opposite. Here's my 5 list of criteria. One seems to be a bit defunct, so it can't be fascism. But I mean, if we have a chair and one leg is missing, all humans will be able to say it's still a chair. It's a bit broken maybe, weaker as a chair. I think we have to be very careful not to use a mechanical method, or to use Marx and Engels' term, a metaphysical method, We have to use dialectics. You shouldn't maybe this is lost on you, won't be so lost tomorrow maybe, but a political version of Carl von Linné, or Carl Linnaeus in some countries. Yeah, you don't know him? Google later. He's Swedish. Was a botanist, amongst many things. Brilliant scientist. That is, you classify one party or movement, this is this species, that is that species, and then you forget to examine them as living phenomena in their process of change and evolution, and not in their interconnectedness, in their concrete historical circumstances, but as isolated dead phenomena set in stone. And to understand a phenomena, you have to study it thoroughly. It's not enough to read one or two quotes by Trotsky on Bonapartism and fascism, and then at glance try to find these in reality. You have to follow his method. And Trotsky's characterization of what fascism was and what Bonapartism was derived out of a careful study of all the regimes in that period. The rise of Mussolini, Hitler, the Bonapartist regimes before Hitler, France and Spain. And to know other regimes, they have to be studied carefully as well today. Not with the intent of forcing it into a preconceived schema. And yes, in a sense, there are different versions of fascism. Not all of them are alike. Nothing in life is. And I think with Mussolini and Hitler, you can see many different differences. And Fiona mentioned one. And again, with Spain, even more so. Not all fascist regimes have to have as powerful a movement as Hitler and Mussolini did. And I don't think Franco would have come to power if Hitler and Mussolini hadn't already done so. I mean, it was mainly down to the mistakes of the labor movement. But it was also an example that was set, support received. And I think this is a general point as well. Once an overturn is accomplished in one country, or two countries, or three countries, then that can become a model to follow and pull other countries in the same direction. And this is not just true of fascism, but of the rise of capitalism. Not all countries had bourgeois revolutions, and the degenerated state of the Soviet Union became a model to follow for others. The same will be the case of genuine socialism. Once the working class comes to power in a few countries, then that will exert a pull on others to follow, a model to follow for the working class in other countries. But I think if you look at Spain, the enormous repression, certainly not like any other dictatorship. Another thing, I think this, Fiona talked about the increased racism that we saw. I think maybe some people sometimes can get a bit frustrated with us. Like we're telling people to be so patient and understanding with people's insane ideas. We have to understand the racist workers. We have to win them over. I think maybe a lot of people feel like, fuck no, I hate them. I hate racists. And that's very understandable. I grew up in the countryside in a place where there was a lot of racism. And towards the end of my teenage years, I really hated everyone. I broke it off with most of my friends when I was 15 for that reason. But if you really want to struggle against racism, against the right wing, and not just be angry all the time and scared, you have to understand where these ideas come from, that it comes from the ruling class, and you have to understand why they've gotten a hold. And you have to understand that, yes, it's partially racism, but it's also a lot of other things that has led to the rise of these right-wing demagogues. There was a documentary made in 2019 in Sweden called The New Social Democrats. It was about Swedish democratic workers who had gone over from social democracy to the Sweden Democrats. And all of them said, I've been a social democrat all my life, my father before me, my grandfather before me. And actually in this documentary, none of them mentioned immigration, segregation, Islam, or anything like that as the reason for why they had gone over to the Sweden Democrats. They said, the Sweden Democrats, they seem different. They're not like the other Stockholm politicians who only care about Stockholm, capital. No. One sawmill worker, he said he had always been a social democrat until he got sick and got to really experience the system. And he referred to Red Ådalen. It's a region. You don't have to translate Ådalen. the A with the dot, whatever. It's a region where he was from, and it has very, very strong militant revolutionary traditions. He said, Red Åldalen, that's the way it's always been. And he was proud of that. But he was so angry at the Social Democrats. And even, he didn't even really mention so much what the Social Democrats had done. Actually, the main problem that he talked about was changes introduced by a right-wing government. He talked about the system. The thing is, in Sweden, the system and social democracy, one and the same thing, really, or seen like that. The Social Democracy is the most establishment party of all, because they have ruled way more than any other party. Another worker, he said that he left the Social Democrats because they promise a bunch of things that they don't keep. They say that they are looking out for the workers, and I am a worker. So what I want is higher wages and better conditions, that everyone should have a good life, like a socialist society. These people are not fascists. They are angry workers, and they've had it with the corrupt Social Democrats, ruining their lives. And they all said they were very open to being won back if social democracy offered something real to believe in. And obviously, there are people who are racist too. We know that, and we have to accept that it will not be a rosy picture until the end of capitalism. There will be polarization, all kinds of strange phenomena, but not accepted as in not do anything about it, but stare it in the face in order to fight it. And I mean, these people who vote for these parties are not the main ones that we're going to recruit. We will recruit those people that Fiona talked about, who want to fight them. But we have to teach them patience, teach them correct ideas and methods, and not imbue them with sectarianism and hatred towards the rest of the working class. And above all, we need to break with all these nonsense lesser evilism. I don't know how many times I've discussed with people who kind of say, yes, I agree with all of these things, but right now we just have to stop this person, we just have to stop that. I think we should listen to what Engels said when he criticized the SPD. He said, this forgetting of the past, the principal considerations for the momentary interests of the day, this struggling and striving of the success of the moment, regardless of later consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for its present may be honestly meant, but it is and remains opportunism, and honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all. This is what led the SPD on the path towards the First World War when they supported their own ruling class. This opportunism has led to disaster time and time again in history, and we have to break with that. And finally, as Trotsky said, only that party has the right to historical existence, which believes in its own program and strives to rally the whole people behind its banner. Otherwise, it's not a party, but a parliamentary coterie, a clique of careerists. It is not only the right, but the elementary duty of the proletarian party to free the toiling masses from the fatal influence of the bourgeoisie. This international believes in its program, so if there's anyone out there on the stream that has not joined this international yet, that wants to free us all of the influence of the bourgeoisie, wants to struggle against the far right and the hypocritical liberals, they should join us immediately, because we promise that we are ready to fight.